We interrupt this program for a very important presidential message.
I'm Donald Trump. Did you know that Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi are both porch pirates? Do you know what that is? There's hundreds of hours of video evidence of Nancy Pelosi coming up on your porches and jujitsuing your precious packages, while Chuck Schumer waits in the street in the getaway van because he's too afraid to be a man and do his own dirty work. She has to do the dirty work just like she always does. A Republican would never do that. He'd never take your precious little tot's choice. Never.
We're back with another live episode. It's been a while since we've done a live stream here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Today, we'll talk about the Derek Chauvin trial with Rajkumar in Minneapolis. We'll also have our Crossroads panel, our very first one, with Hannah Cox of the Foundation for Economic Education and the Washington Examiner, Dr. Nan Hayworth, former Congresswoman from New York, and Michael Hiltzik, LA Times columnist, as we dive into COVID-19 decrees. Where do we go from here? I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner, and Jimmy at the Crossroads gets started right now.
Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix, I said. Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix. I got Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense out of nonsense. Come on, Jimmy, what you got?
Hello, my friends, and welcome to Jimmy at the Crossroads live stream episode. It's so good to be with you today in partnership with the Washington Examiner. Thanks so much for being a part of the program. We have quite a show for you today. In just a few moments, we'll bring you my interview done a little bit ago with Rajkumar. She is a radio host in Minneapolis, a WCCO radio there. And she is a licensed attorney, author of the book Communicate That, Your Toolbox for a Powerful Presence, and she really knows her stuff when it comes to communications and crisis management. That's one of the big reasons why I've interviewed Rashini for many years. She's on the ground in Minneapolis, where the trial of Derek Chauvin for the death of George Floyd is happening. Right now, they're going through closing arguments as we speak. It's a fascinating story, and Rashini's going to break it all down for us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Then we're going to have our first Crossroads panel. I'm so excited to be welcoming onto the show, once again, Dr. Nan Hayworth, former Congresswoman for New York's 19th Congressional District, Michael Hiltzik, LA Times columnist and author, and Hannah Cox. She is a fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education and a contributor to the Washington Examiner, which is our partner here at Jimmy at the Crossroads. Be sure to check out our friends at the Washington Examiner at WashingtonExaminer.com. And before we get rolling ahead with today's show, subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't done so already. YouTube.com/Jimmy at the Crossroads. And also, if you go to Facebook.com/Jimmy Sengenberger Pro or search Facebook. On Facebook, you can search Jimmy Sengenberger Media Personality. You'll be able to go ahead right there and like the page and keep tabs on all the great content that we've got going on here on Jimmy at the Crossroads as we begin regular Monday live stream episodes. This is our first live show in quite a while. And folks, I am so pleased, so very pleased to be welcoming here onto the show my producer extraordinaire. He's back, ladies and gentlemen, Matoush Magic. Nathan, brother, get on the screen there. How are you?
Jimmy, I'm doing great. Man, what a pleasure to be back. I'm looking forward to this.
You know, it's the second button on the left that gets the applause, just so you know. Go ahead, give us applause. We're back.
Yes.
We're back, consistent programming, and it is so great to have you here. Nathan, It's been a little while. Do you think you got the knack of the controls again? Do you know what you're doing?
Yeah, Jimmy. I think this is the return of the Matouche magic. You know, kind of like the return of the Jedi, but the return of the Matouche magic.
I love it. As a fellow Star Wars fan, I absolutely love it. By the way, Return of the Jedi, my favorite Star Wars movie
it's
of
one
all
of mine
time.
as well. I don't know. Empire Strikes Back. That's up there, too.
Empire Strikes Back is the best Star Wars movie, but it's not my favorite. My favorite's Return of the Jedi, although I will say Rogue One, it's the only one that I can give Disney credit for doing a great job, and Rogue One is up there very close, giving Empire a run for its money.
Jimmy, what'd you think of The Mandalorian? How about that? I mean, that's what happened when I was gone.
So
I think
good.
that was the main thing that was out when I was away from the show for a bit. The Mandalorian.
I love The Mandalorian. Not just because Baby Yoda is so darn cute, but because it's Star Wars through and through. It really is.
Oh, I agree, especially at the end there.
Don't spoil it for anybody who
okay.
hasn't seen it yet. I know by now they should have. They should have seen it.
Yeah.
But yes, that scene, the very last scene of season 2 of The Mandalorian, positively epic, Matouche.
Definitely.
no
No, I mean,
mistake.
I lost my breath. I had no words. I remember calling you. I was like, Jimmy, this is insane,
I
man.
know.
Star Wars is back. And you know what's also back? Jimmy at the Crossroads. Live for the first time in what? I mean, I'm sure
However
you've
many
gone
months.
live.
It's been
the
a
first
while.
time with Matouche Magic.
It's been
in
several
like-
months.
in like a year.
I think since October. Oh, less than a year for you being on here, Matouche. But it's good to have you back, Nathan Matouche, Mr. Matouche Magic, producer extraordinaire. We got to run with the show, but brother, I'm glad to have you back.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Jimmy. The honor is mine.
The honor is mine, actually. All right, Nathan Matouche, everybody joining us. We got to get rolling with today's episode of Jimmy at the Crossroads. Right now, we're going to take a quick break, and we will be back with Rashini Rajkumar as we break down the Derek Chauvin trial from someone on the ground, a licensed attorney and radio host who's been closely covering the trial from on the ground in Minneapolis. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner. Jimmy at the Crossroads, back in a moment. Okay, welcome to the auditions for the official voice of Jimmy at the Crossroads. Name, please?
Kermit the Frog.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi-oh, Jimmy the show host here.
Next. Next.
I told you they wouldn't go for it, Froggy. Hiya!
And you are?
Stewie Griffin.
Can you sing a bumper song?
Oh, absolutely. La 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 la, la 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 la. This is so beneath me.
Thank you. Okay, next, previous experience in voice work.
I was a duck.
Next.
Affleck!
Okay, Dr. Evil, you're up.
Okay, everyone. Welcome to Jimmy at the frickin' Crossroads. We invite you to watch for $1 billion.
Mr. Simpson.
Wait.
Mr. Simpson.
Who's talking?
Mr. Simpson.
What?
Over here.
Oh, hey.
Let's hear the announcer voice.
I can't do an announcer voice. Oh, but I can do Mr. Burns. Announcer guy, eh? Excellent.
George W. Bush.
I'm here to auditionify for the announcerification process there for Jimmy Mushroomburger.
It's Sangenberger.
Jimmy In-N-Out Burger.
Next. And you are?
The name is Doc Brown.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Welcome back to the Crossroads.
I love your enthusiasm. When can you start?
Last year.
I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of nonsense. Come on, Jimmy, what you got?
And ladies and gentlemen, we're back on the Crossroads. It's Jimmy at the Crossroads, the interview. Here is Mr. Sang Style.
Welcome back to Jimmy at the Crossroads. I am Jimmy Sengenberger, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner. Great to be with you today, covering a variety of topics. In the next segment, we will be joined for our Crossroads panel by Hannah Cox, Dr. Nan Hayworth, former Congresswoman, and Michael Hiltzik to dive into the question of COVID-19 decrees. Where do we go next? What are we going to do moving forward? What should we be doing now and moving forward when it comes to restrictions on our daily lives with regards to the COVID-19 virus? That's coming up in the next segment here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. But I am so pleased today on this very important day in Minneapolis when closing statements are being presented to the jury in the trial of Derek Chauvin over the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis last spring. And the closing statements are happening as well as jury instructions today. And there is nobody better to break it all down with than Rajkumar, who is a licensed attorney and WCCO radio host in Minneapolis, as well as a communications and crisis coach, who we've been talking since the very beginning with about George Floyd, Derek Chauvin, all of the machinations. Rajkumar, welcome back to Jimmy at the Crossroads.
Thanks so much, Jimmy. It's quite a day, that's for sure.
Yes, indeed. So let me just ask you a very broad question. I appreciate you taking a little bit of time as the closing statements are going on. What's your overall sense for how things have progressed in this 3-week trial?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that's really interesting is that people sometimes don't always remember that the defense's only job is to poke holes at the prosecution's case. And the standard of proof here is beyond a reasonable doubt. And for every element of the 3 charges, the 3 statutes, those statutory charges that Derek Chauvin is charged with, the prosecution needs to prove beyond a reasonable doubt each of those elements within each of those 3 charges. So that's a really big burden. That is all the prosecution wants to do, but it's a big job that they have on their plate. The defense, in this case, Eric Nelson, the defense attorney, really does not have to prove Derek Chauvin's innocence. He just has to poke holes in the prosecution's case. So that's something that everyone should be remembering. You and I have talked about this over the last few weeks, but it is easy for a lot of people to forget, especially because the prosecution gets to start opening statements. Their case in chief was before the defense's, and they do closing statements first also, and they have the opportunity to do a rebuttal statement even after the defense's closing statements today. So those are all the things to keep in mind as we watch this and as you take in what is being said. Another piece to remember is none of us get to see the jury, which is a good thing for safety reasons. But the witnesses, as well as the attorneys, as well as Derek Chauvin, all got to see the jurors during testimony and are now seeing the jurors during closings. So those attorneys, when they're doing their closings, they may be zeroing in on someone. They may be able to notice things that the jury facial expressions, all those kinds of things that they have the vantage point that we don't. So I really caution people to remember it is going to be in the jury's hands after closing statements wrap. And the judge this morning, Peter Cahill, gave very explicit jury instructions as well as copies to each of those jurors to have with them and to review and really follow.
Define clearly, since you alluded to and discussed a little bit about reasonable doubt, what that really means, the idea of beyond a reasonable doubt, and the extent to which the defense needs to place that reasonable doubt in front of the jury.
Well, I like to kind of go back to my law school days of sort of a continuum. So we learn in law school of various standards of proof. There's a preponderance of the evidence. So if the continuum is here, the preponderance of the evidence would be just over 50%. That's not what we have here. We have beyond a reasonable doubt. So we're talking way over 50%, if not almost 100%, that the state needs to prove its case. So that's just the simplest way I can explain it, Jimmy. There might be other criminal attorneys that might give you a little different description, but I think that that helps us understand just how high of a burden this is. So the jurors really can't take into account, they're not supposed to, anything they saw in the media for the last 9-10 months leading up to this trial. They were supposed to avoid, in fact, they were ordered to avoid media, talking to family, and hearing about this case outside of what they saw in the courtroom. So if the jurors did follow all of those instructions, we would hope they arrive in their deliberations with only the evidence in front of them, those jury instructions. They have the ability to ask questions of the judge while they deliberate, but they are sequestered, so they really have little contact, pretty much no contact with the outside world. Even communicating with their families needs to go through court officers.
Once again, Rashini Rajkumar, our guest, licensed attorney and WCCO radio host in Minneapolis, who's been covering this very closely, naturally, as it is your city. And of course, what we have seen in Minneapolis ever since George Floyd's death has been protests and riots. And that all happened last year, but it picked up again this year. Of course, the city of Minneapolis is prepared with National Guardsmen for the potential for riots to break out, regardless of what the verdict ends up being. Schools are back into remote learning. We'll be back into remote learning for a few days coming up here later in the week. And then also you've got this death of Daunte Wright, a 20-year-old black man, in an altercation with police 2 Sundays ago, which sparked new riots that got the defense concerned and saying, hey, we're not so sure that you should be having this trial here in this way without the jury being sequestered because of everything they will see on TV and so forth. Of course, the judge said, we're not going to sequester the jury. We're going to keep things going as they are. And here we are today. What are your thoughts on the unrest, the Daunte Wright component, all of those things, Rashini Rajkumar?
It's really volatile here right now, Jimmy. And last night was the 8th night in a row of protest in Brooklyn Center, which is the Minneapolis suburb where the Daunte Wright shooting did happen 2 Sundays ago, as you say. Fortunately, last night's protesters weren't as numerous. There was no violence that I am aware of, but it really does help you to see that there is a backdrop around which this trial, or within which this trial is happening. Not just all of the riots and looting of 2020, but just these last several days as the trial was closing up. So even though the judge orders the jury not to take in any media, you just don't know what they've heard about what's going on outside that courtroom, because they were home over the weekend. They were packing up their bags to get ready for today and to get ready to be sequestered. So it is really sad. Things are happening both in this community as well as other cities around the country. And there is going to continue to be a reckoning as communities figure out what is the right amount of relations with the police. Certainly we need police in some form. We need public safety. And it's getting very dangerous also for police officers to be officers. A couple National Guardsmen were shot at in Minneapolis a couple days ago, just over the weekend. They did not die. They had some minor injuries, but that just shows you that there are some people in society who believe if you wear any kind of badge, you should be harmed. And I think most of us don't want it to get to that place.
Again, Rashini Rajkumar, our guest. Let's talk about something that I found very striking last week in a piece for The Hill by Professor Jonathan Turley, law professor at George Washington University, where he talks about due process of law and why due process is so important. He says, due process is not a dirty word or a dog whistle. Bogani was trying to do what Waltz was unwilling to do and respect the rule of law. Bogani being the Brooklyn Center city manager who was fired from his job after the shooting of Daunte Wright that resulted in his death. And Minnesota Governor Tim Walz is the Waltz that he was reflecting on there. He says, when reporters asked Bogani if he would fire the officers involved with the shooting, he stated, if I were to answer that question, I would be contradicting what I said moments ago, which is to say that all employees are entitled to due process, and after due process, Discipline will be determined. If I were to say anything else, I would be contradicting the very idea of due process. Officials showed this contradiction he feared by firing him, whether it involves the police officers with Daunte Wright or in the case of Derek Chauvin and George Floyd. Due process of law is fundamental, as you well know, to our rule of law and our protection of individual liberties. What are your thoughts on how that comes into play in both the proceedings with Derek Chauvin and what might happen depending on the verdict, because due process allows for the end result, and also in regards to Daunte Wright's situation?
Well, let's go back to 2020. Due process is not something that there's gray or there's a continuum of due process. Due process is due process. And I have said on your shows in the past, I've said in different outlets and on my own show, that due process was not afforded the 4 officers in the George Floyd events. And that you can say that and still wait to see what happens by way of verdict. You can believe that officers did something wrong or bad, but still also believe they deserve due process. Because in our country, when you don't afford one person due process for whatever reason, the rest of us are in danger of not having due process if we were ever accused of or charged with a crime. So this is such a fundamental tenet of the United States Constitution and individual states' constitutions. It is sad that it really got thrown out the window in 2020 by the governor of Minnesota, the mayor of Minneapolis, and the police chief of Minneapolis by initially firing those 4 officers instead of just saying, okay, we're going to investigate, they're going to have due process, put them on administrative leave. And then if they decided to fire them, that is one thing. But the visual, the optics, and no due process, no one can convince me that was a bad visual in 2020. And the Brooklyn Center city manager, who was fired by the mayor, he was trying to offer due process. And in fact, we noted both the police chief, who eventually then resigned, and the city manager, both were trying to give the benefit of the doubt. And I don't even know that I'd call it that. They were trying to afford due process to Officer Kim Potter. She deserves it, even if you believe the grand mistake that she made. If it's true that she really meant to reach for her taser and not her gun, she still deserves due process. So we have to keep a very, very heightened watch on due process, no matter who the suspect is, no matter who the officer is, because what's at stake is our very fundamental in this country of due process.
So well said. Finally, Rashini Rajkumar, handicap, please, for us the overall arguments between the prosecution and the defense and what folks should keep in mind as the jury deliberations go on for however many days.
So what I can tell you from now at this point in time, seeing most of what I think will be most of the prosecution's closing statements, as well as monitoring their case. And I have yet to see the defense's closing statements, but definitely watched a lot of his case in chief, as well as his cross-examination. I do believe that Eric Nelson, the defense attorney, has opened the door or the window or the crack for reasonable doubt in the state's case. It is there. He opened the door. It's hard to have a straight-faced argument that the prosecution this is a slam dunk. And one of the things we can look at is the prosecution had 38 witnesses. The defense had 7. That's a lot of testimony for the jury to weed through. So that's why today's closing arguments are so important, because it's a way to encapsulate all that you have. But even in what I saw of Steve Schleicher's closing statements so far, is he is trying to pound home some points and remind you of all of their medical witnesses they had and other people on the use of force. And I just am a little skeptical when you have cumulative evidence. I always will be. If you really have the strongest case and can accomplish beyond a reasonable doubt, you shouldn't have to ram a lot of medical witnesses at the jury. You shouldn't have to repeatedly say some of the things that he is saying in closing arguments today. That said, he's strong. He's got some good themes going. And you know how I like buzzwords when you have little time and really need to inflict or influence your opinion on any audience, if you can make it in the simplest words, you have something going for you. But I don't believe that this is just, we're going to get a verdict tonight. I would be stunned if we got a verdict tonight. I think there will be some days of deliberation, and I really hope that everyone can accept what this jury, which is the finder of fact, and that is what Judge Cahill reminded them this morning. He instructs on the law. The jury is the finder of fact. So the different versions they received in court through all those witnesses, they are the ultimate finder of fact, and then they are the ultimate ones who will decide if the state proved beyond a reasonable doubt, or if they will say not guilty, or if there will indeed be a hung jury on any of these charges.
That's how the process works. And it is interesting. Nearly 40 witnesses for the prosecution, fewer than 10 witnesses for the defense. It does seem like the prosecution was trying to have as many people present their case as possible to kind of go to the witnesses and say, look, this many people are advocating for our position or are presenting evidence and points that work in our favor. And I think it's interesting when a side decides that they want to focus a lot of their attention on just a flurry of witnesses as opposed to maybe having massively extensive days with a particular witness or something.
Yeah, exactly. And that is, it can go both ways. It can be like it's overwhelming that these experts think this, or we really know it could be read in a bunch of different ways. So we better get several witnesses to hone this in for the jury. So it would be interesting to know exactly why they went with 38 witnesses on the prosecution side.
Roshini Rajkumar, WCCO radio host. Check out her show on Sundays, and also licensed attorney and communications and crisis coach. Check out our website, ownyourwow.com. Always great to check in with you, my friend. Thanks so much for taking the time to break down this important story on this crucial day.
Thanks, Jimmy.
Once again, Roshini Rajkumar joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. She's always fantastic at articulating legal topics, communication and messaging topics. The list goes on. I highly recommend you check out her work, her programs, and more. Roshini Rajkumar is always one of our all-star guests here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. And that's what we try to do here. Every time we're doing a program is bring you the best guests with engaging, intelligent talk that you will enjoy and learn a lot from. We definitely want that here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we will be joined by our panel extraordinaire, indeed our first Crossroads panel, Hannah Cox of the Foundation for Economic Education, former Congresswoman and Dr. Nan Hayworth, MD, and LA Times columnist Michael Hiltzik. We'll dive into the question, what should we do now when it comes to COVID-19? Keep it right here. It's Jimmy at the Crossroads, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger.
You're an entrepreneur.
I'll give you the alternative.
You're an entrepreneur.
Sure.
You've got to create 30 million jobs over 3 years.
Yeah.
Tell me what companies can do that.
So, first
Tell me
of
what
all,
20 or 50 or 100 companies can do that.
I can't tell you a specific companies that can do that because I don't know. In fact,
Or investors.
But
Pick
I
the
don't.
greatest investors of
Right.
all time.
Well, but I don't presume to think that I know who's going to be the best investor, the best company to do that. Just as I don't think the government is, that I could presume that the government's going to be effective to do that.
Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, with all generations. Oh, what a great mix, I said.
Has been on a determined campaign to convince the world that everything is hunky-dory. And when the government actually spends so much effort trying to convince you of something, you got to be very suspicious.
Your lawyers don't tell you even all the evidence that the government has given them, the few meager disclosures that were made literally at the 11th hour after you'd already been coerced into pleading guilty.
Hours of video evidence of Nancy Pelosi coming up on your porches and jujitsuing your precious packages, while Chuck Schumer waits in the street in the getaway van because he's too afraid to be a man and do his own dirty work.
Come on, Jimmy, what you got?
Is it scary that YouTube and Twitter and Facebook have this kind of power over us?
Of course it is. But you know what? These things didn't always exist, and they won't always exist. David beat Goliath. The little guy can beat the big guy.
So we have to figure out ways to fight in which we are able to have that kind of reach. We can build our own megaphones. And this is a little bit of a longer term project. It goes beyond Trump's re-election because it affects every election.
I'm good, man. It's a partnership. We're like this, Jimmy. I got you.
Jimmy, can I tell you that I've done about 200 shows in the last 3 weeks for this book tour? This has been by far my favorite interview.
And that, my friends, is how America was made great once again. Breaking at this hour, Jimmy Sengenberger is currently at the crossroads of politics and economics. Radio broadcaster master. Now the celeb on the web. He's the smarty of the party. He's in cahoots with the grassroots. Jimmy at the Crossroads brings you thought-provoking commentary, hard-hitting interviews, original satire, and the best bumper music known to man. Jimmy at the Crossroads.
I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of no sense.
And ladies and gentlemen, it's now time for the Crossroads Panel with Hannah Cox, Dr. Nan Hayworth, and Michael Hiltzik, and of course your host, Mr. Sang Style, Jimmy Sengenberger.
All right, I can get carried away sometimes when I'm having a little fun playing harmonica. Welcome back, Jimmy at the Crossroads. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner. There we go. I like the applause. That sounds good. We are doing our first ever Crossroads panel, so I figured why not have a little bit of fun? A little bit of harmonica here on the program. Good to be with you. Once again, please subscribe to the YouTube channel if you have not done so already. Nathan Matoush, producer extraordinaire, working the Matoush magic for us here on the program, and it's great to have him back along for the ride. And today, we are diving into a very important subject. Because, folks, for over a year now, we have been wrestling with the COVID-19 pandemic. That is the pandemic that has killed 560,000 or so Americans to date, and so many more across the globe. We've had government shutdowns and lockdowns. We've had mask mandates and capacity restrictions on businesses, and so much more, including school closures as they're finally reopening. So at this point in the game, where do things stand? What should we be looking at moving forward? And what do the American people need to keep in mind? I am so pleased today to be joined by three guests for our very first Crossroads panel. We'll get their volume queued up and rocking and rolling today here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Welcoming back to the show, Nan Hayworth, Dr. Nan Hayworth, former Congresswoman for New York's 19th Congressional District. She joins us now. And we've got Hannah Cox, who is a fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education and a contributor to the Washington Examiner. We welcome Hannah to the show. And last but not least, Michael Hiltzik, who is a columnist at the LA Times, someone I always love to spar with when we bring him on the program because he brings more of a liberal perspective here on the show. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the show. It is so good to have you on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Thank you.
Good to be here, Jimmy.
Good to be here.
Welcome. We're having fun today. I mean, it's the first time we got the Crossroads panel. We might as well introduce you all in style. So I want to dive right in, though, to the topic at hand, because, look, make no mistake, Americans have been suffering and struggling with both the virus itself and the government policies vis-a-vis the virus. And so I just want to ask a question. How do you think things stand overall right now? And we will go to the MD on the panel first. In fact, the first female ever elected to a full term who is an MD back when she was in Congress. Dr. Nan Hayworth, your thoughts on where things stand right now?
Jimmy, we've made so much progress. We're in so much better position than we were obviously a year ago. Thanks in enormous measure to Operation Warp Speed. That singularly has been the greatest ray of hope that we have had. But it's not just a ray of hope. It is a vital measure by which the American population can be protected from the most devastating consequences of COVID-19. And there have been, as we know, there's been an accelerated and steadily accelerating effort to deliver vaccine doses to the entire American public. I think as of now, or very close to now, most places in the country will allow folks 16 years old and under to get the vaccine. That's wonderful. But I think we have to keep a couple of things in mind. One, the vaccine is meant to help us fight off the infection. It doesn't mean that we cannot ever get a COVID infection. And in fact, we know cases are starting to break through. The question of how we deal with that in terms of a public health threat potentially is a big one, and it's looming on the horizon. No doubt it's going to come up because, of course, people are chafing. About half the American public is chafing at the idea of continued mandates of any sort, including for masks. And about half the American public is desperate to continue certain measures, including, of course, mask mandates. As a doctor, I can tell you this: if you personally wear a mask of N95 type with a filtration capability, fully sealed so that all the air passes in and out of the mask, you will protect yourself from all kinds of pathogens, and not just COVID, but also influenza, cold viruses, all kinds of other things. But you need not be fearful if others around you are not doing that. And I think that's very important for all of us to remember.
Let's go to Michael Hiltzik, LA Times columnist. What's your assessment of where things stand at this moment, sir?
Well, I think I agree mostly with Dr. Hayworth. I think one of the points she made is not actually supported by the epidemiological community, and that is that when you wear a mask, you are really protecting other people as well as, or maybe more than yourself. And thus, if you are in a situation where you're wearing a mask but others are not, they're creating vulnerabilities to you. And this is really a reason for people to continue wearing masks when they are in close quarters, certainly if they're inside in settings where it's hard to socially distance. But yes, we're doing better, but I think caution and patience is really warranted here. I mean, we've seen just in the last month that the average daily caseload has been rising. 7-day average today is about 70,000 new cases a day over those 7 days. Just a month ago, it was 55,000. I think that tells us that maybe we are not being cautious enough, that we're not being patient enough, that we still have to maintain the sort of social hygiene, social distancing, mask wearing where it's indicated, that's gotten us to this point thus far and will basically continue to get us to an improved situation going forward.
Hannah Cox, you wrote a piece a little over a month and a half ago for FEE, Foundation for Economic Education, where you're a fellow, entitled 8 Ways Big Government Botched the COVID Pandemic. With that in mind, how do you assess where things stand right now, Hannah?
Well, I think that things have gotten much better over the past year. I was in the middle of New York City when this first hit. It was pretty scary. There were people dying in the numbers of hundreds a day, and there were body trucks outside that they didn't have enough space to even take the people who were dying to. It was really quite traumatic. Now that we have gotten a year out, we can look back and see that many of those deaths were actually a repercussion of very big government bad decisions, of regulations, of decisions that got people killed in droves. We have also now a roadmap for places that got it right, states that have done a much better job at addressing this, that have done a much better job of protecting their vulnerable populations, and that have been able to actually do that while also not damaging people's livelihoods or taking away their ability to earn money. So we have examples that we should be following. Those examples continue to see lower cases. And yet we still have other states in this country where we continue to see lockdowns persisting. We still have parents that can't send their kids to school. We're having all sorts of unintended consequences as a result of these big government decisions. And so while it is looking better in some places in the country, I still think there are many people suffering under big government policy decisions that are actually exasperating and making the situation far worse. We now know that COVID is not nearly as deadly as we once thought. We now know that the risk of hospitalization is much lower. And we also now know that some of the key things to do that would actually keep people safer are not what we have been directing people to do. And that includes things like working out, watching your diet, getting in shape, consuming vitamin D. We're still not really messaging people these things, even though increasingly we see that those are the number one things that make people safer and more likely to survive this disease. So I think that's where we're sitting. We need to be pushing for state governments to follow successful track records and to implement more of these sorts of approaches that will protect people from illness, but also do that while not having all kinds of other unintended consequences along the way.
Yeah, I think that's pretty well put. I do want to play a clip here because, Michael Hiltzik, you said a moment ago that we need caution and patience, that caution and patience are warranted. And I certainly agree whenever you're dealing with a virus of any sort. But there's also the question that a lot of Americans are wondering, which is, when do we get to a point where we can have greater normalcy, if you will, where things can seem a little bit more typical, where we have significantly less restrictions than the government has in place right now? And this came up last Thursday at a hearing with Dr. Anthony Fauci sparring a little bit with Congressman Jim Jordan of Ohio, where Jordan kept pressing him on the question of metrics. I want to take a listen to this, and then, Michael, get your thoughts on it.
That's what I'd like to know. Give us some objective standards versus when certain things get reached, we might be able to get back to having our liberty. When? What are the numbers?
Well, you're going to see a gradual, right now we're at an unacceptably high level. On a daily basis, it's unacceptably high, regardless of who you are. What you're going to see as more and more people get vaccinated, and we get over 3 million people a day, you're going to see the level of infection come down, and gradually there will be more flexibility for doing the things that you're talking about.
Where does it get to? When it comes down, what number do we get our liberties back? Tell me the number. Tell me the number.
When 90% of the members of Congress get vaccinated.
But you're not a doctor, Mr. Clyburn. He is. What is the number?
Gradually, there will be more flexibility. Michael Hiltzik, we've been at this for over a year now. How gradual do you think he means, and why won't he actually give any sort of metric for the American people to be aware of when we might be at a point that you can be pulling back from some of these serious restrictions?
Well, all right, look, let's be frank about this exchange. Jim Jordan is a blustering horse's ass. He's asking Fauci, he's basically trying to corner Fauci into saying something that can't be supported by the science. When we get to where we are, we will know it. But to ask for a metric today, when we still don't know what the course is of this pandemic, is just stupid. So, I think we can dispense with this sort of exchange. Look, we don't know. In fact, as I pointed out just a couple of minutes ago, the course of the pandemic is not entirely improving right now. In some states, it's getting much worse, and that includes Florida. In some states seem to have gotten their arms around the situation, but they've done it through sort of rigorous public policy and a public community that's willing to accept certain sacrifices. And look, they're not great it's not a great sacrifice to wear a mask when you are in close quarters with other people. It's not, it's something of a sacrifice to have kids out of school, but our understanding of the transmissibility of this virus in school has been evolving, and our policies have been evolving. So we have to let this process continue to play out. There's no way, shape, or form that this country is anywhere near herd immunity. Some states that claim to be at herd immunity aren't anywhere near herd immunity. So we really need to actually look at the facts on the ground and not work this out through ideology. We really need to go with the science.
Dr. Nan Hayworth, your thoughts on the Jim Jordan exchange with Dr. Fauci. Was he out of line, and was he wrong to specifically request some kind of a metric which we haven't gotten up to this point?
No, he wasn't wrong to request that, and I'll disagree respectfully with Michael on several points. Number one, the states that have gotten their arms around, quote unquote, COVID, who have among the very best statistics, are the ones that have been the most liberal in the true sense with their populations, including Florida. Why? Because Ron DeSantis is no more eminent a leftist than Bill Maher himself has said. Ron DeSantis actually does read the science. There is science to follow here, and a big problem is that folks on the left, including Democrats who are owned by the teachers' unions, have steadfastly refused to follow. Children are not, in fact, a major source of COVID. They should be in full-time school, in person, for many reasons. That parameter actually has been fully established by science. The American Academy of Pediatrics, who are not certainly on the political right, said that many months ago at this point. Last summer, they said that. Children are suffering because they're not back in in-person school. That's something Dr. Fauci should be on top of, and he's not, deliberately, because he seems also, unfortunately, to have fallen into the thrall of a political message. We should have a pretty decent idea at this point, and scholars certainly have talked about it, of where we can conclude that we have herd immunity. And I would say, probably, I think lately it's been in the neighborhood of about 75% of those of Americans either being immunized or having had the infection. We're getting steadily toward that point, and a couple of respected experts, including I think Scott Gottlieb was one of them, who anticipated that, by early June, somewhere around there, he's very hopeful that we will have something resembling herd immunity. So it is not a matter of being patient at this point. It is a matter of being activists in favor of eliminating the adverse consequences of an abnormal suppression of economic and social activity everywhere it exists in the United States.
Michael Hiltzik, I'll throw it back to you in a moment, but I want to get Hannah Cox back in. Hannah, what are your thoughts on where things are in terms of the ability for policymakers to roll back these restrictions on our liberties, which we'll get to that aspect of this in a moment, but how do you assess where things stand?
Well, at this point, I largely agree with what Nana said here. I would really start to balk at people who say follow the science. This country hasn't followed the science from the get-go, and we have plenty of evidence to show that now. We see that school closings have little to do with any risk towards children or any actual scientific data that shows there's risk in these schools, but it actually correlates with teachers' unions and where they're strongest. That's the schools that are still shut down. We see as a whole that there have been people who have been saying this from the very beginning. Dr. Rand Paul said this last summer, and Dr. Fauci pushed back on it and fought him and kept schools closed, and then actually had to come out last December, 6 months later, and admit that Rand Paul was right all along and that kids could return to school safely. We see that lockdowns have not been premised whatsoever around science. There's no evidence whatsoever to suggest that lockdowns have correlated with people being less likely to die from this disease. And it's just very frustrating to continue to see people saying we should wait and wait and wait and be patient. It's not much to sacrifice. It is a lot to sacrifice. Kids are falling behind in schools. Their suicide rates are skyrocketing. We see people losing their livelihoods. We see real economic despair. This is not something, I think it's such a place of privilege to sit back and say, it's not that much to sacrifice. It's not that hard to do this when you're sitting at home working as a journalist, which all of us are here. But that's something very else to tell people who are having to go out and still work in service industry jobs or who have lost their livelihood altogether. It is a big sacrifice. This is a huge disruption. We will continue to see many unintended consequences of this for years and years to come. We're only just now seeing the beginning of it. And again, it's not premised in the science. We see places like Texas that have reopened actually see their case rates drastically dropping, while places like Michigan and Minnesota, who have continued to employ strict lockdowns, have cases increasing. We see countries like Sweden that refuse to lock down have better rates than the rest of Europe that did lock down. None of this is actually premised in the science. I think that science is a useful tool. It's something that we should evaluate and look at. And I think an honest evaluation proves that the lockdown people and people who are proponents of these strict measures have been wrong at every step. And we've often been asked to sacrifice our liberties for no return. There's a great Mises quote that I want to bring up that Fee had in an article this week that said the planners pretend that their plans are scientific and that there cannot be disagreement with regard to them among well-intentioned and decent people. However, there is no such thing as scientific ought. Science is competent to establish what is. Science changes, it evolves. We learn more and more. We should follow that, continue to take it into account. But that being said, we should not sacrifice our fundamental liberties and basic rights based on one person's interpretation of the science that, again, has proven to be wrong over and over and over.
Thank you, Hannah. So a lot there. I'll just let you respond however you want to, Michael Hiltzik. Go ahead, sir.
All right. Look, I understand the impulse among Republicans and conservatives to hold up Ron DeSantis as some sort of hero of this campaign because the Republicans don't have a very deep bench other than Donald Trump anyway. But here are the numbers. 7-day moving average of new COVID cases in Florida has gone from 4,400 a day to 6,400 a day in a month. Is this the record that you want to put up for Ron DeSantis? And the other thing, look, I've written a lot about the DeSantis record and really tried to boil it down to its essence. The fact of the matter is that Ron DeSantis's policies were not actually complied with statewide because communities where they knew they had a problem with COVID actually resisted his so-called liberalization of policy and did lock down. And that includes places like Miami and Tampa and Orlando, because they knew that to go with Ron DeSantis's reopening was going to be disastrous. The fact of the matter is that Florida at this point has one of the worst rates of increase of cases than we've seen anywhere nationwide, and its economy hasn't actually done materially better than many other states. Sweden, I think if you go to Sweden and you ask the Swedes, they would say we made a bad mistake. And the Swedish officials who were responsible for the Swedish policies at the beginning of the pandemic have all basically conceded that they were wrong. Sweden does not have an appreciably better economy than its neighbors. It has an appreciably worse record on COVID than its neighbors. That's the facts. That's the science.
Not true.
And to say that, oh, well, science has been proven wrong. The science evolved from day one. This was a unique situation. I think that many government policies in this country were undertaken out of an excess of caution. And I don't know how you can actually say that they were wrong if the goal was to protect what may have been uniquely risky environments, such as schools. Now, we've learned a lot about schools since then, but we didn't know it at the outset. And we learned, and I think we're seeing now that schools are reopening because we have a better understanding of what the risks are. Look, the idea that, we're going to blame the teachers union, that's just ideology, and that's just fatuous. The fact
Michael, I want to let Dr. Nan Hayworth jump in here because there are several things you said. I was noticing some of your reactions, Nan. Please go ahead.
Well, number one, Sweden is not an outlier in Europe for negative or detrimental outcomes from COVID. In fact, their economy has done considerably better than their fellow nations who did lock down. Their morbidity and mortality rate in the fullness of time, I think, has fallen somewhere in the middle of the pack. So they certainly have not suffered.
Look, Sweden.
Excuse me, Michael. I'm not.
Hold on, Michael. Let's let Nan finish first. Go ahead.
Interrupt you, and I'd appreciate not being interrupted now. And I appreciate that you have a particular point of view, and you certainly articulated very cogently. But I have to disagree with you on the facts. When you look at, number one, you cannot ever. Maybe you can do it for the 2 weeks to suppress the spread. I get that. In the midst of the fog of pandemic, I issue a general amnesty to everybody, and I'll extend it out to the first couple of months. I get that. But if you look now at the statistics nationwide, Hannah referred to it, she's right, the so-called unintended consequences, not unintended, yes, but not incapable of being anticipated. And that is the job of rational, responsible public servants. And if you look at what has happened in education across this country, if you look at the rate of in-person schooling being done quite safely, I might add, as it always could have been. But if you look, in fact, the state of Florida is at the top of the ratings. I believe they have close to 100% of their students, if it's not absolutely 100% of their kids, in full-time in-person school. Where's your state of California, Michael, which does certainly manifest your kind of mentality in its government? It is at the bottom. It is somewhere, I think it's still shy of 30%. Do you know all of those students are suffering, all the ones who are not in in-person school, and you should be able to enumerate the consequences because you believe in science. Well, the fact of the matter is that these children are experiencing increased rates of depression, increased rates of suicide among children, because they are so deprived of the social contact that children need. They are being deprived of the identification of child abuse. They are not learning. This is a generation being left behind, and that is what we have to think about, and that is why we have to open up, and that is why Ron DeSantis is the best governor in the United States. And by the way, he's joined by a lot of other Republicans. We have a very deep bench.
Michael Hiltzik, briefly, go ahead before I let Hannah get in.
A couple of points. First of all, California at this point has the lowest rate of new infections in the entire country. Right? So we must be doing something right. Now, let's talk about Sweden, because, you know, I raised it and Nan came right back at me. Right now, these are figures that were published on Friday, okay? Sweden now has the highest new COVID cases per person in Europe compared to its neighbors. Well, let's see, Sweden's rate is 625 new infections a day per million, all right? In Finland, the rate is 65. In Denmark, it's 111. In Norway, it's 132. In Sweden, again, 625. In Poland, 521. France, 491. 430.
Michael, what point are you getting at?
So this idea that Sweden is an outlying success is just wrong.
Did I say that?
You said that Sweden has done better than its neighbors. It clearly has done worse.
I said it was in the middle of the pack for Europe. That's what I said.
In the middle of the pack. It's at the bottom of the pack.
They are not at the bottom of the pack for Europe.
All right, I want to let Hannah Cox jump in here. Hannah, what are your thoughts on where we need to go? Well, first of all, what Michael and Nan have been saying, but in particular, where we need to go from here in terms of a public policy standpoint.
I want to jump up in real quick and correct Michael, because he keeps giving these statistics that are based around COVID cases instead of COVID death rates. And that's what we should actually be focusing on. And in Florida and in Texas, we have seen that they have had either equal death rates or lower death rates than places like California, while not implementing some of these draconian, terrible methods of addressing this that show no evidence of actually having saved any lives. And that's true for Sweden as well. They have a lower mortality rate than the rest of Europe. So I think Democrats are bending themselves in circles right now, trying to find ways to basically explain their continued want to lock down the population and economy. And I think the real reason for that is because they're getting a lot of their policy proposals through right now that they've always wanted to push through and didn't have a shot of getting until this kind of catastrophe hit. So I'd like to see some intellectual honesty here, first and foremost. But as far as where we should go moving forward, again, you know, it's time for the people to rise up. We know what has worked. We know what hasn't worked. We're a year into this thing. We do have roadmaps to follow. We have places that have done a better job. We have places that have been able to balance public health and safety while also not having all of these unintended consequences that we see in places like California. I've been in South Carolina throughout this pandemic. I got out of New York City. I've been a refugee here in South Carolina. It's been fantastic. We've been open. People have been taking precautions who need to, but we've been moving on with our lives. Our economy has not been decimated. People aren't losing their livelihoods left and right. There are places we can look to like that other states should start to implement. And I think it really comes down to the people rising up and saying, we've had enough. It comes down to parents demanding that their schools open or demanding that their legislatures give them school choice so they can take their tax dollars somewhere that is open. These are things that taxpayers have to become angry about because they are being completely taken advantage of in this situation and held hostage by state governments. And it's enough is enough. It's time to push back. It's time to demand that we reopen. That's the only way forward.
Dr. Nan Hayworth, I want to ask you to amplify the point that Hannah just made about death rates and hospitalization, as we keep hearing discussions, such as from Michael, but from others as well, about cases and where case numbers are at. But what about hospitalizations and the death rate? And then in addition to that point, where do you think we need to go from a public policy standpoint, former Congresswoman Hayworth?
Sure. And, I respect and I want to thank Hannah for her very salient points about the role of government versus the role of individual responsibility. And I understand and respect Michael's concern about the toll that COVID has taken and could still take. COVID does have a death rate. There's no question. So does influenza, by the way. So does norovirus. So do many other conditions. And I am not being glib about any of them. We cannot, unfortunately, necessarily prevent every death related to a virus. And by the way, we have to be very careful about causality versus correlation, especially when everybody's being tested for COVID. We also have to be very careful with PCR tests, that those tests, Michael, when you talk about positive tests, you have to know what cycle threshold these tests are being counted positive at. And that may not be a consistent value. If it's over 30 cycles, you can basically disregard the test as indicating an active infection. But apropos of your question more directly, Jimmy, yes, hospitalizations and deaths, particularly deaths, have continued to decline. Wonderful news. Why? Well, number one, we know better how to deal with COVID if people do end up getting very ill. And it's an underutilized intervention, actually, but one that's very important, and that is these monoclonal antibody preparations. President Trump famously received such an infusion, but they are available to folks across the country now. They are being underutilized, including probably in the state of Michigan, where they certainly should be intervening very aggressively. And as Hannah said, the public isn't being nearly as much informed about the availability of these kinds of interventions, and yes, about the vital importance of remaining fit, of getting enough vitamin D in your diet, either through diet or supplementation, of maintaining good general health, and not just incidentally, but prolonged lockdowns have a detrimental effect on people's health, on weight control, on diet, on exercise. It actually probably weakens us immunologically. That could also contribute to some continued adverse consequences. So when we talk about the mandates versus voluntary behavior, it's very important to recognize that, yes, you're right. In Florida, Michael, there has been a lot of voluntary masking. And I have a place in Florida, and I go down there, and there are places that ask us, establishments that ask us to wear masks when we walk in the door, and we comply. But the fact is that the government doesn't have to mandate it, and Floridians are still doing very, very well, and they're able to pursue their lives with minimal imposition. And that's the point. And I think that the folks on the left, Hannah's right, they are pushing an agenda. It is an authoritarian agenda. It is a coercive agenda. The COVID provides them with the perfect pretext, that fear, the pretext that unfortunately grips about half the electorate and half the country. They don't mind having everything imposed on everyone else because they don't trust themselves necessarily, and they certainly don't trust others. to do the right thing. But when I made the point about masking, and I'll finish with this, masks can indeed be effective. I'm not one of those people who says masks don't work, but they work primarily, they work best when they are worn, and Michael did not listen to my stipulation. You have to wear them the way a healthcare provider does. N95 type filter mask, sealed fully, so that all your breath goes in and out of the mask. That is a very specific activity. You have to master it as a habit. It's not something most people do. Double masking comes closer to that. But if you do that, if you as the individual do that, very important point, other people around you don't have to mask up. You are protected. That's what you do in healthcare.
Mm-hmm. We're wrapping up here a few more minutes with our Crossroads panel. Vibrant conversation. Dr. Nan Hayworth, former Congresswoman, joining us. Hannah Cox, fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education and a contributor to the Washington Examiner, our partners here on Jimmy at the Crossroads, and Michael Hiltzik, LA Times columnist and author. Michael, your thoughts on what's been said, and also where you think we should go from here from a policy standpoint. And I'm especially curious to the extent to which you think we should be talking about the death rate and the number of deaths and what we've got with hospitalizations versus just emphasizing consistently the number of cases as you have been. Go ahead.
Okay. Since Hannah tried to tag me as somebody who ignores fatality rates, let's look at the rates. Florida's fatality rate is 163 per 100,000 residents. California's is 151 per 100,000 residents. California's rate in recent weeks is down by 26%. Florida's is up by 20%. All right. This is the consequence of premature reopening of a society, and by an ideologically based reopening of a society. So we know that, look, Florida has not been successful. It's really in the top, I'd say, 25% of states in terms of the toll per capita in that state. And that's with communities that really were concerned actually imposing the sorts of policies that Nan says, well, you know, this is authoritarian. It's, I mean, this is deeply into the fever swing here. The fact is that what we do know is that social distancing, mask wearing, and other sorts of social hygiene do work. We have seen that nationwide. We have seen it community by community. The best big city in terms of the record on COVID is San Francisco, where their rules were pretty rigid, and compliance with those rules was enthusiastic by that community, and it succeeded. So what we need to do is just not veer off into talk about, you know, well, we're depriving, government is depriving people of liberty. It's the pandemic that forced upon us these sorts of policies that we know work. To say they don't work, they don't matter, is just balderdash. And we know this because the numbers are right in front of us.
Well, Michael, one thing, though, when you're talking about any policy debate, it's never just cut or dry. The pandemic or any issue that comes before us doesn't mandate a certain policy. Policymakers make those decisions. And so to that point, where do we go from here as far as, and you say that there's not a metric that we can be looking at. So what should we be observing in order to get to the point where we can satisfy Michael Hiltzik and start rolling things back?
The point I was making about Jim Jordan's outburst, you know, is completely idiotic and pointless outburst, is that we don't really know where the end point is because we don't know what the course is going to be of this pandemic yet. And the trends that we have in front of us right now are not that positive. So for him to demand from Anthony Fauci, who's not a policymaker himself, some sort of deadline, some sort of cut and dried metric is just blustering. It's theatrical.
So then, Michael, what should we be looking for? What should we be looking for?
We should be looking for the resumption of a trend of fewer cases per capita going forward. We should certainly be glad that the death rate has come down, but that reflects basically advances in the science and the implementation of treatments that we didn't have a year ago, and now we have it. And yeah, they should be applied. So what's wrong with that? Mask wearing. I mean, to turn this into a political, ideological, authoritarian issue is really dangerous, and it really has a lot of.
All right, Michael. I want to get we're over time, and I appreciate all of you for sticking around longer than anticipated. Dr. Nan Hayworth, please go ahead, especially when we're talking about the idea of metrics and this discussion that we need to reach a certain point, but we don't know what that point is.
Michael, again, I respect his concerns. I know he means the best, but he illustrates the innumeracy of the left. When he was citing the figures, I believe it was 163 deaths per 150,000 in Florida versus 151 deaths per 150,000 in California. Thank the good Lord, those are very small numbers. 0.1%, 0.2%. The overall death rate for COVID is 0.4%. If you have a 20% increase in a 0.1% rate, that's going to be what? 0.12%. So it's still a very tiny rate. Again, we want it to be zero, but we have to understand that that is not likely. We have to be realistic about where we are and what we can do for each individual patient. And remember that a lot of deaths that are tagged with COVID or of COVID are actually with COVID, not necessarily because of COVID. One of the things that we can do better is standardize those metrics. And yes, because we have a federal system and we don't have, every measure in place to standardize that can make for some challenges. But the key thing is that, yes, thank goodness, technology marches on. That's the whole idea. Thank you, President Trump and team, for Operation Warp Speed, for facilitating the development through deregulation, through streamlining processes, by cutting through the kind of stagnant bureaucracies that unfortunately Dr. Fauci has come to symbolize almost more than anything else. We have made enormous strides therapeutically and in terms of preventive measures. That's marvelous. Anybody in this country who wants to wear a mask should feel free to do it. And I will defend their right to do so to the death. But we should not expect that all of us should be required to do it. That is an imposition, especially when you look at children, that is unreasonable and unnecessary. But it's something that, yes, if it's done voluntarily, bravo, that's the whole point. And that's why Ron DeSantis has been so wise in Florida. He has let his citizens decide. And as an executive, in terms of public health measures, he's done the right things to protect the most vulnerable populations in his state, because that is his job. And he's done it very well and better than just about anybody else in the country.
Hannah
Certainly
Cox.
not.
Yeah, thank you. Hannah Cox, briefly, the liberty government balance here is very important, and I don't think we should understate or ignore the liberty issue at all. Please talk to us a little bit about that and your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I find it problematic for someone to say that this pandemic and all the repercussions of it were the result merely of the illness and not government's decisions. Governments and policymakers do have to weigh matters of public health with matters of civil liberties. But to say that that is an ideological weight is bonkers. This is a human rights consideration. That's what civil liberties and natural rights are. They're human rights. And to take those away, that's a very heavy, serious decision. And it was not warranted in this case. It continues to not be warranted in this case. Again, we have not seen those decisions actually produce lower mortality rates at any point that they've been tried. In fact, we continue to see higher death rates correlate with stricter states. We continue to see more vulnerable populations that have died at higher rates in places like New York and New Jersey versus places like Florida. I really, really take issue with the fact that people say follow the science and then ignore the very real science that points to these factors. At the end of the day, I don't think it was ever warranted to take away people's rights, but certainly a year in, there is no excuse at this point. No one has attacked individuals making the choice to mask. No one on this call has attacked masking in general. We've all been very fine with people who want to wear masks, protect themselves. I'm fine with people who want to stay home, staying home. Absolutely. If you are at high risk, do what you need to do to protect yourself. But there's a very big difference in doing that versus trying to continue to force an entire population to lock down and give up their liberties for an undistinguished amount of time based on the whims of people who've been wrong time after time after time over the past year.
All right, 30 seconds for each of you, starting with Michael Hiltzik as we wrap up, and I appreciate your generosity of time. Michael, LA Times columnist, go ahead, sir.
Well, once again, we're in the ideological fever swamp. This is really not about imposing restrictions. This is not about depriving people of their liberty. This is about saving lives. We know what works. We have seen it. Social hygiene works. Social distancing works. Mask wearing works. And for people like, Jim Jordan, Hannah, to say, oh, it's all about liberty and people should be able to do what they want. That's just wrong and dangerous. And it already has cost lives, and it will cost more lives.
Michael, I think, though, and I do want a quick response from you on this, I think what we're talking about most especially is a balancing act. And it doesn't seem like you're considering a balancing act at all. It's just, let's have the government do whatever they deem is appropriate, and to hell with any concerns about liberties.
What liberties are we talking about? Asking people to
running
wear
your
masks,
business?
Asking people to, look,
going to church?
Look, the American consumer voted with his and her feet about whether to reopen retail. We have seen restaurants, reopening has been slow because customers are wary about going into those retail establishments, and probably so. So, most of this is really consumer driven. It's not government driven.
Thank you.
Government mandates help.
Thank you, Michael Hiltzik. I appreciate it. Nan Hayworth, I think that what he just said about consumers making decisions actually helps make the point about people making responsible decisions for their own livelihoods and lives.
Sure, and I think across communities it's going to vary significantly. Again, I have a place in Florida. Florida's open for business. The restaurants are happily, quite honestly, crowded with people who are happy, again, to comply with mask mandates when they're asked to walk through the restaurant with a mask on. We all bring our masks. We all do that. And everybody's fine with these voluntary measures, but it's about trusting people's good common sense and yes, expecting those empowered with the force of law and arms, namely government, to do the minimum necessary in their responsibility, in their role in protecting public health in a more general way. And they do have to be guided by the science. And what does the science say? The science says that children should be in-person education all the time, and it doesn't hurt the kids and it doesn't hurt the teachers. Any teachers who can't do that should find other ways of participating in their profession. But when Michael talks about ideology, unfortunately, the government party tends to be that of the left, tends to be the Democrats. So it is those of us who don't want government to dictate everything to us, because government is made up of fallible people, and we have seen that over and over again. We expect science to be respected and the imposition to be miserable, and we will continue to fight for that, even if it's on something like masking. I don't want to be forced to wear a mask if I don't feel it's necessary for me, and we know it's not necessary for public health. It's fine if you wear a mask, Michael. If you want to protect yourself, wear an N95 fully sealed, you'll be protected.
Hannah Cox, last word to you.
Yeah, well, I don't agree that consumers are voting with their feet. Restaurants are popping around here and have been for months. They're doing quite well. I think that's an anecdotal experience in California because largely they're still locked down. As a whole, people want to move forward. And for those that don't, it's because they're being fed a steady stream of fear porn by the mainstream media telling them that this is more deadly than it is. We see that consistently people are misled on the likelihood of dying from this, on the likelihood of being hospitalized. And we see that Democrats actually poll much higher in their rates of misperception on this. So So I think it really matters where you get your information. It matters where you get your news. And it matters that you actually think for yourself versus following the science that you're being told by people who have not followed the science whatsoever throughout this pandemic. When people say, you know, what rights are we asking people to give up? I want to address that specifically. It's not the right to not wear a mask. It's the right to earn a living, to work a job, to provide for yourself, to get access to education for your children. These are the rights that we're talking about, and they're fundamental.
Very well put. I would say this, too, and I don't want to give him too much credit, but here in Colorado, where I am, our governor, Jared Polis, has now decentralized almost everything to local decision makers, and a lot of counties are now starting to permit 100% capacity and more, and that's because of looking at the science here and the spread and hospitalizations and deaths and having a very complex view of the situation to conclude that, yes, we can start letting people make decisions how they want to live their own lives. Michael Hiltzik, LA Times columnist, former Congresswoman and MD Nan Hayworth, and Hannah Cox of the Foundation for Economic Education and contributor to our partners at the Washington Examiner. We went way over, but this was such a great discussion that I couldn't resist continuing, so I hope it all worked out for you guys. But thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jimmy. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Once again, we had Hannah Cox, Michael Hiltzik, and Dr. Nan Hayworth all joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. And boy, what a vibrant and I think very important discussion on the issue of the day that is right before us, which is where the government should be headed as far as policies. Governments across the country. We're talking about local governments, counties, municipalities. We're talking about states. We're talking about the federal government. We have to have that kind of discussion. And yes, we actually do need to make sure that liberty is part and parcel of the discussion. It's interesting, and I always enjoy having Michael Hiltzik on because he very clearly expresses his views, and I think does so very well. I think he's wrong here, of course, but that's because he's saying it's an ideological battle where only one side is being ideological. Those who want to address the balancing act, the need to strike a balance between liberty and security, something that Ben Franklin talked about way back in the early days of our republic. We always need to have that discussion of a balancing act and make sure that we do not dismiss liberties. It is ideological on the other side, on the government control side, to say, nope, forget about liberty. Let's just focus on a top-down policy approach from the all-knowing, all-powerful government. On this question of liberty, I want to play cut 4. This is a snippet of Dr. Fauci and Congressman Jim Jordan in the congressional hearing last Thursday going toe-to-toe, and then Dr. Fauci's follow-up comments yesterday on CNN's State of the Union when asked about this very topic of liberties. Take a listen, cut 4.
You're indicating liberty and freedom. I look at it as a public health measure to prevent people from dying and going to the hospital.
You don't think Americans' liberties have been threatened the last year, Dr. Fauci? They've been assaulted. Their liberties have.
I don't look at this as a liberty thing, Congressman Jordan.
Well, that's
I look
obvious.
At this as a public health thing.
I don't enjoy those kind of confrontations, but I mean, it was very, very clear. You know, he was talking about liberties that were being restricted. This has nothing to do with liberties, Dana. We're talking about the fact that 560,000 people in our country have died. We're talking about 60 to 70,000 new infections per day. That's the issue. This is a public health issue. It's not a civil liberties issue.
This is a public health issue. It's not a civil liberties issue. There are a lot of folks on the left who rightly complained about the Patriot Act. When conservatives, a lot of Republicans said, we need the Patriot Act for security. This isn't a liberties issue. It's not a civil liberties issue. It's a national security issue. And I would surmise that folks like Michael Hiltzik or President Biden, I can't surmise President Biden at the time, but a lot of people who are liberals would say, you know, we should have that balancing act and we should keep in mind liberty. Yet we're talking about a pandemic here, and they think that there's one way to go about it. The way of the all-knowing, all-powerful federal government. The Dr. Fauci genius who should be making these determinations about how and when we're allowed to live our lives. That is not a situation where we actually apply that balancing act. The United States of America was founded upon the principles of liberty. The very idea that each and every individual ought to be of right and ought to be free to think, free to act, and free to choose. That's the founding principle. And the role of government is to protect our individual rights, not to trample upon them. As our guests, Dr. Nan Hayworth and Hannah Cox, were pointing out before, we certainly did need some actions on the government's part, or it was at the very least acceptable for the government to take some steps, especially early on. But now we're at a point a year later, you know, Dr. Fauci said, gradually, there will be more flexibility. Gradually. How gradual do we need to be a year in? Flexibility, what kind of flexibility are you talking about? It is a wonder in this situation that Governor Jared Polis of Colorado, a Democrat, is actually decentralizing. I don't think he's done nearly enough, but it is impressive to see a Democrat at least take that sort of step at this point in time. But then you go into the media, and the mockery of the media of any discussion of liberty. How dare Jim Jordan challenge Dr. Anthony Fauci, who's just got the best interests of this country and the American people at heart, and he's the genius we should be listening to. Let's go to Chris Cuomo, brother over on CNN of Governor Andrew Nursing Home Cuomo, and this is what he had to say, Chris Cuomo, Thursday night in reaction to the exchange between Congressman Jim Jordan and Dr. Fauci.
Solidarity behind science. We know that that's what it takes to bring COVID numbers down, and we know that is what is needed to end this pandemic. All of us know it. So what was all this, when do we get our liberty back, on Capitol Hill today by Republican Congressman Jim Jordan? It's people who believe what he believes who don't want to get the vaccine. Why isn't he talking to them about giving the rest of us our liberty back? Instead, he decided to blame Dr. Anthony Fauci, the nation's top infectious disease expert, over when. Tell me when. When do we get it back? I get it. It's a big deal. No, it's not. Not to you. You want to make it about division. And that's why he took several minutes of time that he could have been saying to people, hey, listen to Fauci, get the vaccine, let's get through this. There's nothing wrong with wanting to know when this could all end, but it's hard to see how attacking Fauci helps. You know when it ends. It ends when you get our crap together, right? And you get the vaccines and you get to a certain point and you have too many people on the right who don't want to get the vaccine.
It ends when you get our crap together. When we get to a certain point, what is that point? What does it mean to get your crap together? They're so vague and for a specific reason, not because, oh, we need to have sort of flexibility in government tools, but it's because they don't want to give a metric to the American people and then not hold themselves to that metric. So you just listen to Dr. Fauci. Gradually, we will get to a point with greater flexibility. You listen to Chris Cuomo. Get your crap together. At some point, we'll reach a certain point, and then we can start talking about liberty. Can you believe the hubris of these people? And how they look down upon anybody who wants to have any sort of consideration for individuals being able to make their own decisions and live their lives, take care of their children, ensure their kids quality education, and more. It's just, it is hubris and it is arrogance that undergirds somebody like Chris Cuomo. And that attitude of dismissal. Gradually, we will eventually make it to the point where we have our crap together. That's it. Ladies and gentlemen, at this point, it's not that you should be dismissing the virus. No doubt about it. This is a virus that has killed hundreds of thousands of Americans, especially with comorbidities, especially obesity and overweight. I think Bill Maher pointed this out the other night. Maybe 73%, I think, of people who've died of COVID have had obesity or overweight issues, if I'm recalling correctly. That's important to keep in mind. This is a serious virus for sure. Nobody's dismissing that. And I'm going to be taking the vaccine. Wanting liberty doesn't mean I'm not going to take the vaccine. You can walk and chew gum at the same time. And yes, indeed, you can walk and chew gum at the same time when you're talking about liberty and taking precautions and doing things to address this virus. It is long past time for us to start prioritizing the liberties of the individual and making sure that they are sacrosanct as they're supposed to be here in this country. And so I give kudos to Jim Jordan for that exchange with Dr. Fauci, because he actually was willing to make the point and say, what is the metric? And Chris Cuomo mocks him because Jim Jordan approached a congressional hearing as a sitting member of Congress in a way that differs from what Chris Cuomo would have liked. Again, serious virus. Need to continue taking those sorts of precautions, being smart in how we address it. But we also need to not dismiss liberty, because our nation was founded upon liberty. And it's not that the folks who are advocating for it are ideological versus the left not being ideological. Quite different. Quite a different story, in fact. If you believe that the all-knowing, all-powerful government can step in and right the ship and fix all of our problems, that is ideological. And it is not actually based in any real in-depth study of history or reality. We'll see where things go moving forward, but make no mistake, we need to ensure that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness remain top of mind here in the United States of America. I want to thank Hannah Cox, Dr. Nan Hayworth, and Michael Hiltzik for joining us for a very vibrant discussion today. Also, Rashini Rajkumar for breaking down earlier in the show what's going on in terms of the Derek Chauvin trial and what to expect now that the jury is on the verge of its deliberations as closing arguments have been going on today. So my thanks to all of them for joining us, to our partners at the Washington Examiner, and to our producer extraordinaire. He is back. He is brave to come back. Matoush Magic here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Well, that is it for us today. Thank you so much for joining us, being a part of the program. Certainly do appreciate it. If you have not done so already, please go ahead and subscribe to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy at the Crossroads. We are back with more Monday live streams. About 1 p.m. Eastern is our goal time to get started every Monday. Be sure to tune in. We appreciate you being along for the ride. New stuff coming out with the podcast, too. Have a great day, and may God bless America.
Talking politics, great for generations. Oh, what mix. I got Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.